as many of them as possible, but I want to get to the phones. Mike is in Stratford-on-Avon. Mike, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.
It's interesting that last text you just had there as well, because I too am a veteran of Afghanistan who now works in the mental health sector.
Well, it's a good job you weren't around during the war then, otherwise we'd all be speaking German.
No. How would I have hacked it, eh? But, in working in the environment I do, I get probably asked the general question of the many questions you've been asking this morning around when is it a genuine issue and when is it just feeling sad. I get asked that almost every day, and it's very difficult to give a very binary answer, and sometimes I feel like I'm copping out by saying, well, it's dependent on the individual and their circumstances, but it really is. On the differences between generations, the first thing I would say is I think that every generation thinks that the generation after them is softer than they were. Yes. I think that's just hardwired into us as human beings. But that aside, when people ask me that question about the resilience of young people, it can be coming from a place of genuine care, actually worrying about their own children. I just ask them to look at the experiences that their children are gaining at a very early age, growing up, that perhaps me, looking at my background, growing up in a little village in Essex of 100 people, would have been protected from. And it's easy to cite social media and smartphones as the only reason for that, but it is a big reason. We know there's a brilliant book called The Anxious Generation. A lot of people are lauding right now from a guy called Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, we had him on. We had him on the show a few weeks ago.
Oh, you've had him on. Yes. He's amazing. Yeah,
it's not universally lauded though. I mean, there has been some pushback, and there has been some challenge to some of his theories. He's particularly interested in unregulated social media, but you know, the climate crisis, intergenerational inequality, wage theft, all of these things are, you could argue, the logical response to them is what would once have been described as a mental disorder, but is now, I'm thinking of that old joke about I'm not paranoid, they really are out to get me. There are lots of things to be very, very, very anxious about at the moment.
Absolutely. And when your attention is turned inward on yourself, predominantly through things like, I sound like I'm banging on about smartphones too much, but it does put our emphasis, things like social media, it does put an emphasis on the self. And you think about the way we communicate with other people now, everything that you communicate is up there to see and to turn over. And do people like what I say? Do people not like what I say? It doesn't really lend itself
There's
to
an internal
self-esteem.
An internal tumult that is almost impossible for many adults to turn off or to turn down. A pal of mine just got back from holiday, and he said to me this morning, he said, you know, I actually managed to zone out for a whole week, and I can't remember the last time I did that. And that's on holiday in a beautiful part of the world. But that is because of these infernal things that we all have in our pockets. Can I ask you something which I don't think you have, well, you probably have thought about before, given how often you're asked the question about where the distinction lies between what you might call sort of traditional feelings and medicalised conditions. How confident are you that? Where do you derive your confidence that tightening the lid, screwing down the sensitivity, stiffening the sinews, pulling up the socks, people living repressed lives, didn't sometimes benefit from that?
Yeah, I think I think there is something to be said for resilience and owning your mental health as well. Yeah. It isn't someone else's responsibility. In the same way with your physical health, you can have all the wonderful support and rehabilitation and equipment and everything that you need. If you aren't willing to get your backside out there and go for a jog or sit on a mat and strengthen your leg, it's not going to get better. So I think there is an element of ownership. My question would be, where did we learn that? What's different with us? We're all born the same, you know. So where did a previous generation learn that resilience or take it from? And I tend to find myself thinking a lot of it will be community, the protection of community. There are a lot of factors, clearly we understand, where someone is faced with inequality or intolerance or stigma or a lack of safety or care in the home, that obviously lends itself as a risk factor to challenges and resilience. But I think there is an element of being bombarded at a younger and younger age with the ills of the world, as well as a cutting off and isolation. We live increasingly vicariously. We don't operate in communities. I've heard you talk a lot about community and connection before, and I think it's something that's really undervalued and underemphasised when we talk about mental health. We think a lot about diet and exercise and sleep, which are all really fundamental cornerstones. But I think connection and community is something that has been eroded. You add a pandemic in there, which at a formative age for our young people, they were stripped of all of that. I think that is going to turn anyone inward, and that's going to worry anybody. So I think that there is something to be said for cultivating resilience. But my question to an older generation bemoaning a younger is, where did you learn that? Where did that come from? And how can we recreate, rather than just bemoan the fact that they're all snowflakes and they can't deal with it? Because I don't think that's fair.
You're bloody good.
Thank you, James.
No, you really are. I bet you're great at your job. Because I literally said at the beginning of that, you may not have given this much thought before, so it possibly is a little unfair to ask you the question, but you just knocked it out of the park.
I give it a fair amount of thought.
Yeah, clearly. Let me read you something that ties in with what you say and possibly focuses upon the fact that community doesn't always mean the broader group around us. This is from Rich, who works as a listening volunteer with the Samaritans, and he says one of the things that many people say when they call is that they don't feel they can share their mental health issues with family and friends. It's heartbreaking when they say things like, I don't really have anything to worry about, or there's loads of people worse off than me. Mental health issues are not necessarily logical. Please don't be afraid to reach out if you're struggling. And he reminds us of the number for the Samaritans, which is, of course, 116 123. And that's why incidences of suicide in particular among young men are the highest in society, aren't they? Because we are, I don't know if I can say we anymore. I could when I first started talking about mental health on the radio, but I don't know if I'm a young man anymore. But young men are the most likely to feel that they are letting themselves down or letting the side down if they talk about emotional vulnerability, if they talk about mental health. We
don't want to burden other people. We feel a guilt about our own situation. Again, that's something
masculinity, bogus masculinity hardwired into us. Briefly, if you would, because you've been so impressive, what made you make the shift from military to mental health training?
So I, like a lot of people who work in this area, have had my own challenges, and I have felt everything that you just described in terms of looking at my own privileged situation with a job and a roof over my head and everything you'd want, and wondering, what have I got to feel anxious and lonely about? Why does everyone else seem to be able to just cope and do it? And what's wrong with me? And that, again, doesn't lend itself to sharing, because you feel that guilt and that shame.
Something wrong with me.
I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate to get support. And then, because I had done a bit of training delivery before, I was able to take that, put it together with my passion for mental health. And during the pandemic, it sounds awful, but there was a high demand for us supporting people with their mental health. I don't want to say it's good for business. That sounds awful, but you get the premise. And I'm lucky that I have a live-in marketing communications consultant in my wonderful wife, who is able to help me take the lead to create my own training consultancy, and I deliver a lot on behalf of charities, and I've got a trustee role and lots of stuff. But it's the one thing, if I can just steal 5 more seconds to say, is through the raft of all the things I do, from giving talks to at the base level awareness training right through to suicide intervention training, the one thing that comes through as a consistent thread in how to help someone else, I would say to your listeners, is helping someone to feel less alone. Whether you agree with what they're living with, whether you feel the same, whether it would affect you in the way it's affecting them, if you can help them to feel less alone, even if you don't do anything, even if you don't solve it, even if you can't rescue or fix them, which is very rare, if you can help them to feel less alone, you can save a life. So I would just like to get that across to people today, regardless of where they are, what they're doing, how they feel about others' experiences, if that's okay.
I think you have.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.